Okay, hello everyone. Well, we are about to start a working session on a topic that I don't think we've talked about here, at least not recently, which is the attempt to apply some of the formalism from our physics project to economics. And it's a little bit, we have multiple fields that it seems that the formalism that we've developed has the potential to apply to. And there's a certain feeling of if it's Tuesday, that must be economics type thing. So we're kind of starting from a little bit of a standing start here. James has prepared a few talking points here, and we've about a year and a half ago we did quite a bit of work on this, but we've been off doing meta mathematics and other kinds of applications since then. All right. So with that said, let's take a look at what James has prepared here. Okay, James has a definition of economics here. That could be very controversial. The creation and capture of value through decision-making processes, says James. What would Fred say? Does Fred have an alternative or an attack on that definition, just so I understand where we're coming from?
I was thinking about this, in fact, just yesterday. And I was trying to capture in my take with the way humans achieve their goals. Mm-hmm. It's a rather broad definition.
Right. But I mean, this concept, yeah, I think this is one of these tricky things. I mean, I think it could be the case that, the definition of economics has the same role. I don't know. And when you do biology, the definition of life is not all that important. It may be more important in economics because particularly in defining what's economics and what's psychology versus politics or whatever else.
Yeah, right. I mean, look, one thing should be said at the outset, which is there are many camps in economics and there are just many areas of economics. So we're doing some initial meta modeling here, but you could produce all kinds of meta models for economics, and we will. But in order to do that, you have to delimit some scope. That's what I've tried to do here. That's what these original remarks are about.
Fine. So
it's not economics with a capital E. It's just one particular exercise that I thought I could do.
So what's an example of a question that one would like to have? I mean, what one would like to have a definite answer to. Like for example, the one that I was interested in a couple of years ago now is, why do cryptocurrencies have value? If they do, presumably they do. But to be able to explain that without having to say, oh, because they provide utility and they let you do things without having to, whether there's an abstract definition of value that is independent of the kind of of bars of gold and things like this.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to meta model value creation, competition, and profitability from using simple rules.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's take a look here. So
those are the original goals.
Okay. So von Mises, market prices can be understood in terms of human preferences and decisions. What do you mean by understood? I mean, it's not obvious there's a market price for things at all. I mean, it could be the case that everything is bartered. Couldn't it?
Well, yes, in some cases it is.
Right. I mean, there are plenty of unique things for which there isn't a market price.
Well, in this case, the market price would be the exchange ratios between whatever is being bartered. So you don't really need prices are exchange ratios effectively.
Right. Right. But it's still, but you have to have a repeated trial. I mean, if it's the Mona Lisa for a castle or something, or whatever it is, neither one, you don't get to repeat those. Maybe you do.
Yeah, okay, but the point here is that we're not just starting with some economy. Let me put it that way. It's not just that we have an economy and then we're asking what's the price of this economy. You have to build it up. You have to build it up in terms of, as we'll see in the examples below, you have some initial capital and you have some rules. Okay, and these rules are describing things you can do in the economy, and then it gets multi-way because humans will do different things, they'll make different decisions, they have different preferences. And from that, you get some sort of market, which is going to be branchial, as we'll see, and you'll see profits and competition, this kind of thing emerge from there. That's the point. It seems simple, it seems like a trivial point, but not all economics works like this. Sometimes it's like boom, you just have an economy. You start from there. Let's start analyzing it. Von Mises with this whole thing called catallaxy. It's like, well, how did we get here? How do we actually get these markets in the first place? How can we think about it in terms of the actual individual behavior?
I have never heard that term, catallaxy, which is perhaps a sign of my lack of education. And
well, maybe not that familiar with the Austrian school.
I believe von Mises invented it himself.
Yeah. Yes.
So, unless you're familiar with von Mises, you wouldn't have heard it. I had never heard it before.
I mean, the reason why I've picked von Mises is I have this book from von Mises called Epistemological Problems in Economics. And I think that just based on what we've done in physics with observer theory, and because von Mises likes thinking about individual choice as the bedrock, if we're going to have a multi-way system where the multiness has to do with, different kinds of behaviors that you can pick, and if the point of the physics project is to see, what kind of spaces, et cetera, are produced from that, then this seems like a good approach to take.
yes,
And von Mises had influence on, Morgenstern, who ended up working with von Neumann, and Hayek, who was actually kind of politically, economically influential. So von Mises is somewhat influential, and I think that his work is amenable to meta modeling.
what would your average, not that there is an average, modern economist say about von Mises? That's a dead silence.
I'm thinking.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard him described with some respect, but with some kind of, he had a simple way of thinking about things. And
yeah,
I don't know what, I don't necessarily know what the and is.
Well, I mean, what I've read from him is almost like economic philosophy. I almost treat him as like this kind of philosopher of economic liberalism. And in the period that he was in, I think he felt like his views, his most important task was to like kind of rhetorically and philosophically defend them, because there were all these different kind of approaches to economics, including, socialist ones, et cetera, in Europe at the time. But the point is here, look, I'm expropriating von Mises's framework for meta modeling purposes. Whether or not von Mises was good enough as an economist in his own right, I don't really care. I just want to find concepts in economics I think lend themselves well to this kind of meta modeling. And I picked von Mises as an initial example. We can work with all kinds of different economic theories.
All right, okay, let's move forward with this one.
Yes.
Okay, economic time is facilitated, you say, by purposeful human actions undertaken according to subjective value.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, economic time, I would assume, is measured in part in what transactions take place. That is, if everybody just sits there and doesn't do anything, in no useful sense does time pass for the economy.
Yeah, but I want to add something else to that, which is, so imagine if you have some economy where there's really no innovation, maybe it's even bartering, and people are just exchanging, goats for yams and yams for cloth, et cetera, et cetera. If you actually graph that, it's just going to be a cycle. I actually did that just to kind of, it's not in this notebook, but I just did that as a test. So the point is that you can have transactions, but you have to have some sort of value creation. You have to have new things being made possible through the allocation of capital and the production of new kinds of goods. That for me is economic time. I think basically value creation occurs alongside a time like hypersurface. And if you just have the kind of circular, exchange of the same goods that your parents were exchanging, et cetera, you're kind of timeless, I think.
Okay, here's a naive economic history question. At times in history when, was there inflation in those kind of cyclic systems? My impression is that, like in antiquity, it's known because there were, they put on stone tablets, the standard prices in the Roman Empire of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
My impression is that there wasn't a huge amount of, that cycle actually is a closed cycle. Is that true or is that not correct?
No idea.
Fair enough.
Well, there is inflation in antiquity, but it has more to do with the fact that coins were minted, and then the gold content of coins was decreased by government fiat.
Okay.
Right.
When the prices changed in terms of the gold commodity, that's much less clear.
Right.
Wait, but just to be clear, there was economic time in antiquity. I'm referring to an almost absurd, situation in which people are, I mean, all kinds of new stuff was still made in antiquity. There was still innovation and invention in antiquity. I'm talking about if you suppose a system in which people really are just exchanging the same goods and not really producing anything novel, I would say that economic time is not really advancing, even though there are exchanges. It's a point that you can't just have transactions. You have to also have value creation, in my view, for there to be real economic time.
Interesting claim. I reserve judgment on that. I mean, I think it's like saying, does the universe do just fine even if it's not expanding? And the answer is, if to knit together space-time, you have to have kind of lots of things happening. You don't have to have expansion in order for space-time to be a thing. In order for something to emerge that is space-time, expansion is just a twiddle on that, so far as we know. So it seems like one could imagine a knitted together economy without its expansion, but perhaps not. Let's see. I mean, I
guess the point is, like, maybe it could be made more nuanced, but you can imagine a situation in which, every year you have some exchange in some small community, and the exchanges are basically the same every single year. There's not that much variation to it. Well, if you graph that, I mean, it's just going to be a cycle.
No, I understand that, but I mean, if on the other hand, if it has spatial, if they're trading and it's a broader, and maybe that's a version of your economic growth, is if the kind of spatial region over which transactions happen, the number of agents in the transactions increases. Maybe that's the some version of this as well. Let's go on.
Yeah, let's go on. Sure.
Okay, economic calculations, decisions made according to preferences. Okay, does not need to explain why agents value products. It only needs to model the consequences of actions undertaken according to subjective value. Yes, I mean, I think that the fundamental thing is that the question is, what can one conclude about economics without knowing what on earth is in the system? Without knowing whether it's iPhones or Apples or whatever kind of Apple it might be. In other words, so a question would be, in a sense, the pure plumbing of economics. What conclusions are there? Just like we can make conclusions, in the extreme case, we can make conclusions about thermodynamics just from knowing there are a bunch of molecules bouncing around and they have computational irreducibility. Right. That gives us conclusions which turn out to be of human relevance, like gas laws and so on, just from that very basic thing. So a question would be, in economics, what are the similar, the possibility of having single prices for things might be kind of whether one considers that surprising or not, I don't know. I think nobody thought that the emergence of space-time was surprising until you go down below space-time and start saying everything is made of atoms of space, and then it's much less obvious that you will get something like continuum space-time. So it could very well be that there are things in economics where nobody thinks they're surprising until you kind of go down to a lower level, and then you say, how does it actually fit together to make this?
Yeah, I mean, I think what will be surprising, and I have an example below, but I think one thing that's surprising is you pick a certain number of simple rules for building a toy economy, and you're just trying to make sure that those rules seem reasonable, and then you run them and you see what happens. And when you get behavior that you didn't encode at the front end of it, I think those will be the surprises. And so long as we have a good grasp over the terms of economics and we can properly interpret the graphs, that for me is the art of meta modeling. It's setting up rules and really being able to interpret your results according to the field of interest.
Yes, but I think one of the problems in economics, as you've talked about, is there just a lot of tentacles. I mean, in physics, one of the achievements of 20th century physics was to reduce the number of things you have to talk about to a fairly small number of degrees of freedom, which are the core things that physics talks about. I mean, you don't have to separately talk about, the behavior of a planet versus a star versus a this versus a that. We just have a sort of universal law of gravity and universal statements about space-time. And it's very likely to be the case that economics is not similar. I mean, that's a question, and that's in a sense what you're alluding to here. is, has economics been broken down into something which is as small a number of degrees of freedom? And I think the answer is no, not really. Is that a fair statement? Or, I mean, you know, if we were to, okay, so let's assume we have a virtual world economy, for example,
Sure.
which, and then we ask the question, where we can observe everything.
Mhm.
And we ask the question, what, well, in that case, we see a gazillion transactions happening. The thing we don't get to observe is the internal states of the agents who are making those transactions, because those are humans outside of the game type thing.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And von Mises's point is that you don't really need to worry. I mean, some people want to know that. And even some economists, I mean, trying to understand the psychology of human behavior, right? But I think for von Mises, the point is that economics actually becomes something to study as soon as you have people who are behaving in deliberate ways according to value. Once you have people actually acting on what they prefer or what they want, then studying those actions, that's what economics is. Not trying to make sense of why are people, why the heck do people drink Diet Coca-Cola, for instance. That's a psychological question. You don't need to worry about that. It's just if people are buying and selling Diet Coca-Cola, then that's an economic question.
Your basic point is there is potentially an emergent facts about economics, just like there are emergent facts about gases that don't depend on the preference of the gas molecules to scatter this way or that way.
I think the point is you're going to have some economic structure, and that is going to be built up from something. But I think that what it's built from are basic rules about how the economy works, and different decisions are going to be made, and those can be expressed with multiness. And you can just account for all the different possible decisions that people actually make in the economy. Why they make them, you don't have to worry about it.
Well, but the analogy that I still want to come back to is, this question about what is the psychological preference of the person about buying this product versus that product.
Yes.
To what extent is that analogous to what is the preference of the gas molecule about whether to scatter this way or that way?
I get it. Yeah, right.
And the point about gases is that at least with the scales at which those operate and how we operate as observers of those things, it actually doesn't matter. For many of the things that we want to observe, the details of the preferences of the gas molecules are irrelevant. What happens is a much more robust phenomenon that emerges because of just computational irreducibility plus large numbers of gas molecules.
Yes.
That can be robust. But now, in the case of gases, we have certain properties like the gas laws and so on that emerge from that. Now, it could be the case if you were trading gas molecules or something, that might be completely, saying, well, we've got the gas laws and, be happy, we've got some science that comes out of it. You might say, but that's just totally irrelevant. I'm trying to figure out something that is not what you are, the thing that emerges that you can robustly tell something about is just not the thing that the trader of molecules cares about, so to speak.
It's the trader of molecules like taking arbitrage opportunities when something is, not quite Gaussian or something like that.
Right. It's
But one thing about the difference between people and gases is that, so I understand what you're saying, but there's one little caveat, which is that you don't have to worry about, why a particular agent makes the choice that they make, but you still presume that it's based on some subjective notion of value that you just don't care to study. Now, the reason why that nuance is important is because then that irreducible behavior that comes from all the transactions in the overall value network, that itself is actual value creation. It's value creation because it's done according to intentional, purposeful action according to preferences. So that's just one key nuance.
Let's take that apart for a second, okay?
Yeah.
So in the case of gas molecules, we have energy conservation, for example, and that's important for certain properties of gas molecules. Now, you're saying that in a kind of hidden variables-ish way, that people, each agent who's making a transaction has some internal perceived notion of value that is causing them to make the transaction this way rather than that way. And I think you are implicitly making the assumption that that subjective value is coarse-grained relative to the microtransactions. That is, that if the person is going to make 100 transactions, that the rate at which their subjective notion of value changes is slow compared to the rate at which those transactions occur.
No. This is not the point that I'm making. The point that I'm making is if you have some multi-way graph that's based according to human decisions, right? And if you have, specifically in this case, if you have something like a value chain, right, then the things that survive in the economy, time-wise, are going to be things that are innovative and are continuing to create value. That's why people continue to spend more money or make more goods, or you have time continuing in economics. If people didn't have any preferences and there was no subjective notion of value, then time would be this kind of empty, vacuous notion in economics, but it's not. Things are you're supposed to innovate and continue to create value with time. So even though you don't care about why people do what they do, you're presuming that in something like a value network or in a value chain, as people continue to produce new goods and contribute more capital to making new things, it should be the case that it's all in service of, continue to create new value in the world. That's kind of my
so look, there's several different things. I suspect the phenomenon I just mentioned, namely that preferences change slowly compared to transactions. I suspect that something like that would be an example of a robust, if that's true, to take that assumption, that is analogous to saying that's a statement about, if not economic observers, something like that. And it's a kind of statement like the statement that one makes about gases, that the typical observer is coarse-grained and large compared to individual gas molecules.
That particular point is interesting. I mean, I imagine that probably you could study elasticity in that way, about the relative changes of preferences with respect to underlying, fundamentals in the economy. That's interesting. Thinking about elasticity as an observer question is interesting.
Okay, but let's keep going on your. So what you're saying is, okay.
I just want to be clear that this, as I mentioned in the key focus section here, is I want to meta model the way that value chains work, which in this case, basically by definition, as these chains continue to advance, with time, you should have value creation. Now, we could have different kinds of economies. We can do all kinds of different meta models. That's the particular one that I have here. And this comparison of physics and economics, I would restrict the purchase of this glossary that I have here to this particular meta model. Eventually, when we do a bunch of meta models, maybe we can reconcile all of them, synthesize all of them, and come up with a definitive glossary. This is obviously not a definitive glossary.
Okay, but so let's talk about value creation for a second, because one key piece to that maybe, which I think we've talked about before, I think Fred and I have talked about also, is this thing about you've got raw materials in the world and you are aggregating them to make iPhones or something.
Yes.
And so from a computational point of view, what is going on there? The answer is that is, I mean, it's an observer-like thing, I think, because the raw materials are lumps of tantalum lying around in some pond somewhere, or wherever tantalum is probably mined out of the ground. And it's all very somehow messy, complicated, and not understandable. And the objective, by the time you've combined, gazillions of pieces together to make the car or the phone or whatever else it is, that has turned it into something which has a sort of clear human purpose. I mean, in other words, it's
I understand. So I mean, this goes back to even what we were discussing with respect to SETI even last week. I mean, the point is that underlying all this, you actually do have supply chain activity, which is global. You have manufacturing and mining and all this stuff happening on a global basis, and that's some irreducible computation. You need to go through all those steps in order to get the iPhone. But the other point is that you're able to build an abstraction tower on top of that irreducible computation to something highly reducible. And I do think that the more abstract and reducible you can make something, the more profitable it'll be.
Well, definitely. I mean, but so the basic point is, I mean, it's like, simple marketing messages work best or something. I don't know what the right term is, but I mean, this idea that what you eventually want you are taking the chaos of the world and trying to turn it into something. I mean, technology is this kind of thing about how do you take what is available in the world and make it useful for human purposes.
Yeah.
Human purposes are simple compared to everything that's on offer in the world.
Sure, you're just trying to extract reducibility, but you have to create irreducible. You have to look. I think there's 2 points to this, which is I think, oh man, the material prerequisites for technology, basically the value chains, the supply chains, those things are irreducible. You have to go through all those steps in order to actually make the thing. But then you want to be able to extract something reducible from that underlying behavior, and that's exactly how this abstraction tower framework works.
Right. But so the thing that is useful to us humans, because we are computationally bounded critters, is reducible stuff. It's not useful to have the raw tantalum. It's only useful to have it in a form that it has been sort of highly, made to have predictable behavior of some kind.
Yeah, so predictable. There's only like a few buttons now on the on the phone. Yeah, right. Yeah. Even a BlackBerry was too complicated. You had to get rid of all those buttons. Yeah, definitely. Extract as much reducibility as you can from the underlying system. Okay, so where does this fit in? So this is pre all of that. It's not pre everything, but I wanted to first just meta model the underlying irreducible computation. Now that we can do the coarse graining, that's a good second step. But before we do one, right, you have to have the actual value chains and the value networks there first.
Okay, but so what you mean by value-added activity is, in standard economics, there's this. It's just you're taking raw materials and you're doing things to them.
Well,
is that fair?
Yeah, but then imagine remember, okay, at one point you had Henry Ford, this whole thing in economics called Fordism, right? Where you have some assembly line, and that's how you make products. Now it's completely decentralized all over the world through offshoring, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not just that you take, bananas from the trees and you make banana bread out of it, right? You have cars that are being assembled, and you have all kinds of goods that are being subject to multiple stages of manufacturing and shipping, et cetera, through these logistic
right. So the supply chain of the world is really complicated. So supply graph of the world is really complicated at this point. Yeah, I don't even know. Yeah. It reminds me, as we've talked about biology and we've talked about trophic levels, right? Yeah. Of what eats what. I actually don't know. I don't even have a good sense of this. On land, it's 5 trophic levels for animals, and then the ocean, it's like 25 or something. But I just don't know. If you look at the supply chains of the modern world, and you looked at the graph starting from all the raw materials, how many levels is it? How many different, for example, that's somewhat measurable by how many transactions take place of, somebody mines the raw, the minerals, they make it into ore, somebody, sell the ore to somebody else. There might be some vertically integrated companies that do lots of it, but
yes. Well, that's the idea. Often with with meta mathematics, for instance, right, you have some generative model, and then if it seems like you could use this to explore data, then you get data, and then you try and model it the same way. So this, exactly what you're describing, that's what I want to try and model here. You begin with some raw material, and then you end up with a Tesla or something, but there's a lot that happens in between.
Anybody have any sense of how many levels it is in actuality?
It's going to depend on the product, right?
Well, I know it is, but roughly. Are we talking in the modern world? Is it 50 levels? Is it 300 levels? I just don't know.
I have no idea.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising we don't know.
Hey, Fred, but one thing, one thing that I've wanted to know is anyone who's in finance, for instance, to what extent do people in finance think, geographically, logistically, in terms of the actual kind of physical mechanics of how the world economy works in terms of infrastructure, shipping, supply chains, this kind of thing? How closely do people pay attention to this stuff?
Depends who it is.
I'd say only when the borders become important. Nowadays, you have, the point is that people who are not directly involved in the production process didn't even notice the complexity of the supply chains until something bad happens. As it happened.
Yeah, well, right. Well, this is my point, which is, as Stephen was saying about this coarse graining, I think for the most part, if you're a consumer in a, I'll even say in a kind of maybe a largely consumer society. I mean, most people we know are there are more consumers than there are producers usually in society, right? So we're getting these kind of coarse-grained understandings of how the economy works. But I think I've wondered for some time if people in finance would benefit from this kind of unraveled picture of all this irreducible behavior. Because
some people pay attention to it, but not many. I mean, that's not the dominant form of, a lot of people just look at the statistics of what happens and try and tease out little correlations where they don't necessarily understand what those correlations are coming from.
Yes. Yeah, right.
I mean, I know, there's a project that we considered doing years ago now, which was a kind of a consequences engine where you should be able to answer the question, if a thing happens, if an earthquake happens here, what effect will that have in the world?
Oh, wow.
And that was, so we got a certain distance into looking at what was needed to do that. And, there are all kinds of pretty granular types of supply chain data that one can get, like, what goods were loaded on a ship in, some port in China or something. Some of that data is available.
Mm-hmm.
And the giant pile of whatever, some number of, a crate full of paper or something of the bill of lading of the ship or whatever. But yes. I think, but I don't know the answer. I mean, all I know is that was not a thing that, at least at that time, it's probably 10 years ago now, that was a thing where people had done little tiny pieces of it, but there definitely wasn't a large scale sort of story. I mean, people watch specific pieces of this. I don't know, Fred, maybe you have a more detailed analysis of this.
Well, I'm not sure how much data is available. I mean, what people have looked at are, a proxy would be, if you have countries that export products that could in principle be made in other countries, that would be a proxy for concentration of production, and then supply chain. Specialization. That would mean, everything, all chips are coming from Taiwan. So somehow, the supply chain has concentrated on Taiwan, and there is more exchange activity in that direction. So the supply chain is more fragile with respect to chips.
Yeah, right. But that's okay. I mean, and that eventually, if what this is a model of, in the end, is what you're calling value networks.
Yeah.
That what that is an idealized model of supply chains. Is that right?
Yeah, it's like you take all the supply chains and you kind of knit them together into like a fabric, like the entailment fabrics we had in MetaMathematics.
Yeah.
So then, a supply chain, it's going to be ultimately, it's going to be for some particular good or for some, particular basket of goods or some company. But the overall economy, can't we treat the overall economy as just the network of all of these? Or at least if we're just looking at it, if we're looking at it from the production side, why not?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, the question of what, there could be a whole giant proboscis of network that grows out because people want purple iPhones or something. And the question of whether that grows or not will be a question of the external human preferences, of whether there's a giant fashion for purple iPhones or something. But
right.
That there may very well be a generic fabric that doesn't depend, whose properties depend very little on whether there are, it's a purple iPhone fad.
Yeah, I mean, this won't apply to purple iPhones, but I do know I have this nice book about logistics clusters, and I was reading about how there are certain kind of stations near the end of these chains where you have all of these customization capabilities kind of there. So if people want, if people want the goods customized in these subtle ways, they have all of that capability there, like right at the end, where you're kind of closest to where consumers are. You're like right at the end of the supply chain, and then you just include those particular customizations right at the end, and you send them to people. So in that case, if it's run well, it doesn't really mess up the supply chain too much to have customization. That's just some particular set of choices that happens kind of more deep into this overall value, in this case, the value chain or the value network.
Right. I mean, it's a particular, like Dell was famous for doing that with computers. Of you can order a computer with very specific characteristics. The opposite approach to the the iMac type approach, where it's just there's only one version of it. I think, and I think I don't really know. I would suspect that as there is more sort of computational insertion into manufacturing, yeah, it becomes easier and easier. When you have a robotic production line or something, it becomes much easier to say make each car be slightly different, because you just, than if you have something which is a more traditional, it's something more traditional. But yeah, okay. So let's go on and look at this.
Let's look at a graph.
Okay. All right. Let's
Well, let's look at some rules. Okay, so again, you can make meta models with all kinds of rules. I tried out one. I think that they're kind of reasonable rules. Let's just go through them. Okay, so we have capital, duh. Okay, we have products, yes, and then we have innovation. And this is just because I don't want it to just be products. I also want to differentiate, when people actually create something that's new or interesting in the economy.
How does innovation occur on the left-hand side of a rule?
I don't have innovation on the left-hand side of the rule. It's only on the right-hand side of this particular rule.
Okay. But I mean, so what you're imagining here is that there is capital.
Yes.
And I mean, each node here is supposed to represent a complete state of the world or a local state of the world.
So as it is in the glossary, I describe it as it's a state of net value in a value chain or in a value network. So I thought about this because you asked me this yesterday. I don't necessarily think it's a state of the world. Let's not think about it as a world. Let's just think of it as some value network, because maybe there are several of these and they're disconnected in the world or something. It's just within this system at this time step, these are states of net value, possible states of net value.
Okay. I mean, just so I understand, in the most naive kind of supply chain, it's like I'm making a car, and I have subsystems in the car, and it's basically, it looks like a tree, because I'm taking all of this. Well, maybe it doesn't look like a tree. Maybe that's wrong, because maybe it's the case. Okay, so first question is, without any notion, without any notion of capital, what does a supply network look like? Okay, so one thing you could say is it must be a tree, but it isn't a tree, because there could be, that same piece of iron, right? It could be a tree. Ultimately, it's somewhat tree-like, because one's taking lots of things and assembling them into one thing. Lots of components are assembled into one thing.
You could have merging.
I know. This was the point I was about to make. But for example, e.g., iron may occur in many components. So it is the case that so here's a very concrete version of this that we could look at. Okay, it's sort of an outrageous case, but let's just look at something for a second here. I'm just curious how this works. So imagine that we're looking at engineering systems, and let me just pull something up here. Conveniently, we have our system modeler system, and system modeler has the actual engineering structure of lots of kinds of things. So my question here would be, if I take, what do we want to take? Let's take, I mean, this probably isn't, I think it may not be a detailed enough model, but okay. Let's try, these are probably somewhat granular pieces of the whole story. But the question would be, if you look at these things, you ask the question, how much repeated stuff is there? In other words, what's the network? Okay, so this is a very concrete question for system modeler, because system modeler has been used to do jet engines and all that kind of thing. So the big system modeler has been used for 50,000 components. So the question is, in a 50,000 component engineering system, what is the dependency? What is the sort of common sub-expression graph? I mean, that gives us some sense of to what extent the same, to what extent, I mean, in the end, we've got some number of chemical elements and they're about to be reused a gazillion times to make the things we make. But there are larger sub-assemblies which may or may not get reused. And that is telling us the extent to which, I mean, that's not your value chain, but it is another kind of well, what is it? It's part of,
it is like a value chain, but this is, I think, more granular in that we're really thinking about each individual manufacturing step, so to speak. That's
which is more granular. Your version?
No, your version.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the version that I have is more abstract than this. I can describe what merging would be in this case. I mean, in this case, it's like you start out with some raw capital, and if there's merging, how I would understand it is, so let's say you're starting out with some basic raw materials. You could start, an enterprise in all kinds of different ways based on the capital that you have. But I imagine that in many cases, different enterprises are ultimately going to arrive at, the necessity of some common product. Like maybe you need a vehicle or a cart or a basket or something, right? Because even if you're selling bananas, or it doesn't matter what you're selling, if you're an entrepreneur in one of these areas, you're ultimately going to need to innovate and create the same thing, right? So I would regard that as, I mean, look, we're starting from some initial condition, which is just raw capital, right? So this particular model, even the first 10 steps or so are going to be some very elementary economy, probably.
I'm right? Still looping back on an issue. Okay, so the question is, in the end, what one is trying to achieve, as one is trying to achieve throughout technology, is take the chaos of the world and sort of corral it into a form that is useful to humans.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the ultimate. That's both the goal of technology and presumably the goal of the economy. And presumably, it's the goal, many pieces of the economy which are not to do with physical objects have the same feature. That is, you're trying to collect things so that, I mean, even these things about stating prices and so on is all about, you could just have the barter level and you could have to do these giant barter chains and so on. But actually, you want something which is computationally more straightforward to deal with. So, I mean, in other words, okay, so here's a possible global view, perhaps. I mean, it could be the case that lots of activity inevitably leads to computational irreducibility.
Yes.
But that then lots of what counts as sort of useful economic stuff is the turning of that computational irreducibility, which we could identify as like heat in thermodynamics, into useful mechanical work. And so we could take the analogy that kind of, one point of view might be, and maybe this is, I mean, one point of view might be that the whole, I'm not quite sure this is right.
No. I mean, if this is the trying to extract reducibility from the consumer side, from the usefulness side, maybe even from the utilitarian side, from the underlying irreducibility that's needed to make the thing, then I agree. That's the point.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that it's just making the thing. I think that there is, I suspect that, for example, let's take markets as an example.
Yeah.
There is likely to be some inevitable irreducibility generated through the dynamics of the market.
Sure.
That you then have to sort of put a gloss over to make it human understandable. Because otherwise, it's just like, what's a good example? Fred, I'm sure, has a good example of this, where you're having to take, I don't know, somehow this is related to.
You mean markets in general, financial markets?
No, I mean what you've got to do is somehow simplify it, because everybody could do their own barter transaction, but instead it makes much more sense to just quote a price for, the dollar euro conversion price.
Yes.
And even though it could be the case, in other words, centralizing it into a market is, even though somebody could be doing, the black market, so to speak, somewhere, which might not be a market, it might just be a barter type thing somewhere off on the side, it's still, there is a great tendency, if you want to build on things, to have, simplicity in the middle. That is just being able to say, there's this price. Okay, now we can build some other whole tower of stuff based on the, just knowing that there is a dollar euro conversion price.
Yeah, right. I mean, one good example is, sorry, Fred. No, Fred, you're kind of soft, so I don't always hear you. Sorry, please go ahead.
One example of what Stephen is saying is OTC versus exchange quoted derivatives. In principle, you could do like an option trade with a bank directly, but instead people choose to do this with standardized contracts in exchanges because it makes them more transparent, it makes them easier to trade, and then you can build up other things on top of these. So this is one example of how simplifying things enables you to make more complex things that you desire. Right. So I mean, the claim is, one fundamental claim is, a goal of sort of humanizing things so humans can, or making things into building blocks. That's kind of at a computational level, that's what product development is about taking these, is about somehow, is it really coarse graining, or what is it? I mean, it's this thing so that you can describe what happens just in terms of a smaller number of degrees of freedom, and you don't have to describe all the pieces inside. You can just say, but I mean, is that, I'm still trying to understand how that relates to like value creation. The fact that you've got,
well, I think the point is, this is how I've been viewing it. You have some long path to get you the iPhone, and there's so much value that's been created through the value activity in doing all of that. So you have all this value that's kind of available to you, but you have to find a way to take all the value in that path and basically create some, it has to have its own reducible ontology, basically. You don't want to describe every single step. You don't want to describe every single mechanism, right? So you have to find a way to take all of that irreducible work and make it into some sort of reducible product.
Yeah,
that's basically it's just taking that whole path, and instead of and then basically just shrinking that down to something that people can actually grasp. And if you do it wrong, people are just going to see a bunch of wires and
right. So they need an API. I mean, in software terms,
yes,
it's like turning something into, turning things into stuff that has, components that have understandable APIs.
Yeah. Yes. UX in general, UX is basically, reducible coarse graining of underlying.
Right. And so, by the way, the exact same thing happens in these, systems engineering systems, that you take, each one of those complicated gearboxes or something is eventually just a gearbox.
Yeah. Right.
And,
right.
And I mean, the issue is when it's sufficient to describe things just in terms of the lumped variables, so to speak, and when you don't have to go and look inside. And that's similar to the whole fluid dynamics versus molecular dynamics story, I think.
Right.
But so what you're saying is, what we expect to see in one of these supply chains is that at each step, you are creating a kind of productized thing. You've got raw materials, you're turning it into some kind of aggregated thing that has a simple API that can be passed to the next level.
Yeah. And I mean, one other thing is, I think that for consumers, the reducible end product is perfectly fine. But I think for economists, you want to be able to, you want to have some dial where you can adjust the resolution of this. And in some cases, you want to actually see what the underlying, it's like, I think that almost being releological, or at least being kind of empirical, like what you do with empirical metamathematics, trying to understand what the behavior is underneath. I think that's where all the, you can, at least for maybe finance, that's where the opportunities will actually come in.
Okay, but let's take a virtual world, for example.
Okay.
And people are exchanging, it's a pity Philip couldn't join us here, but maybe another time. You know, in that case, one has sort of complete knowledge about what's happening inside the virtual world.
Right, like this graph, for instance.
Well, yeah, but I mean, my
actually,
question.
no, because this, I think one thing is that this graph is like, you could make this, what is it? There's like, you could use maybe full evolution graph structure or something instead of states graph, right? And this would be much more hairy because it would actually have, it would be highly deduplicated, right? So this is actually,
it would not be deduplicated. In other words, it will matter which instance of each state you generate. But I just want to imagine what the supply chain graph.
By the way, why don't we just say duplicated instead of non-deduplicated? That's always tripped me up.
Oh, because nothing is being duplicated. It's just that is the natural way that it works. I mean, duplicated is just an action of duplication.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough.
But I mean, let's just imagine this virtual world case, and let's ask the question. You know, as you build things up in this virtual world, you might start off, you know, you're trying to fit out a house in a virtual world, and then you sell the whole house.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, how does this relate? Okay, question, basic economic question. These things like velocity of money, like how many times the thing turns over, I mean, how is that related to this whole, or is it not related to this whole, you know, number of steps in the supply chain? Because presumably in each step in the supply chain, somebody is buying something from somebody.
Yes.
And so that means money is changing hands at every step in the supply chain.
Yep.
So how does the presence, I don't know what, you know, in the economy. Okay, the question is, what's the apex predator of the supply chain? So
well, wait. Let's do one thing. You want to know about velocity. Now you want to know about apex predator. So the first thing is, do we actually, this is like do we have a crisp notion of velocity in the physics project? I mean, we have a crisp notion of momentum, right? I mean, so one thing is, I think that the cause, so here's one thing is, you take this particular graph, you don't actually see the exchanges, but the exchanges will be the events, right? So the causal graph will be the graph of all the transactions in the economy, right? If you have the multi-way causal graph, then the flux of edges there will be the momentum, right? So that would be like I guess like the money momentum in the economy, something like that.
Okay, so hold on. Basically, in the physics project, you know, energy is associated with the density of activity in the network, which is different from and
right, and it's the same. And momentum is the same thing, but it's for the multi-way causal graph.
No, momentum just has to do with whether it's through time-like hypersurfaces or space-like hypersurfaces. I mean, momentum is not. Look, momentum in the physics project is measured with respect to space, and in the case of, you know, in what you're talking about in this, I mean, okay, there's a question here, all right? There's an analog of space for economics, just like there's a, okay, let's try and tease this apart. So, I mean, there are many different sort of actors in the economy, you know, some number of billions of people and things like that. And, you know, they're doing transactions between each other. And one could imagine that there is a graph of all those people. And that graph could be defined spatially, you know, in some agrarian society, people are just trading with their neighbors perhaps, and they're not, you know, maybe they have some market town that they take things into, but basically it is determined by physical space. And another possibility is that the economy is, you know, that people are just trading with whoever they're trading with. And in a sense, the structure of this sort of pseudo space, economic space, is determined by that network of transactions. So in other words, you could say, I mean, and one could, that's a direct analog of what happens in the physics project. That is that the economic fabric is knitted together. I mean, we've got these two different things going on. We've got a bunch of different sort of things that are the analog of atoms of space, perhaps, that are individual sort of economic agents. And then we've got this. I don't fully understand.
Well, look, here's the thing. Let's take a lesson from the MetaMathematics project. There are different levels of resolution at which you can meta model, right? In the MetaMathematics project, we often do not go all the way down to the EAM level. We don't go sub-axiomatic. We have X's and Y's. We have, some circle plus operation between them. We have two-way rules, right? We're not going all the way down. And in that way, the economics project actually kind of differs from the physics project. It's usually with the physics project, with hypergraph rewriting, you always start from some atoms of space. In MetaMathematics, we usually don't. We definitely do not go all the way down to the bottom level.
Yeah.
Often. And in this case, what I have here could be, it could be greatly non-deduplicated. This is not really an agent model. This is a model of many different choices. Wait,
I know you're mostly modeling the branch
I
shield direction.
wanted to ask something though. I mean, I'm opening up the glossary in the physics book. I mean, momentum is the flux of edges in the multi-way causal graph through time-like hypersurfaces. That's what I said.
Yeah, except that you don't need there's a confusion there because the multi-way part, that's quantum momentum. You don't need the quantum part. If you just want classical momentum, it's and I'm not sure, maybe that wasn't as clearly understood when we were first launching things, but then classical momentum is you're just looking at the flux of causal edges through time-like hypersurfaces. There's a more complicated case, which is quantum momentum, but I don't think that's what we have to consider here. I mean, let's see, this is the network. The analog of space is the network produced by interactions between entities, which may or may not be actual sort of raw agents. But I think what you're doing here is much more a branch shield story, and I want to understand that.
Yeah.
Because you're saying I'm
saying markets are branch shield, so we'll get there.
Okay, but I mean, you're saying that. I mean, there's a question of, are you invoking some kind of ergodic hypothesis, or are you saying that, like in quantum mechanics, we're imagining that there simply are many paths of, many threads of time, and it just so happens that the observer spans multiple different threads of time. But in this case, what you're saying is that there are many different things that could happen depending on some external human preferences. But are you imagining that somehow all of them happen somewhere? Or are you imagining that the particular history of an economy is a single path through this graph?
I think that they're all happening somewhere, because this should be some value network with many different value chains in them. And if you're a consumer, you should be able to parse this and find, what it is that you want within this overall value network.
Okay, but hold on. You're making essentially an ergodic hypothesis. You're saying that there are many possible choices humans could make, and that somewhere somebody is going to be making each of those choices. Is that right? Or are you saying...
No, what I'm saying is that if it's in the value network, then someone should be making the choice. Because if someone isn't making if no one's doing it, well, but I guess I'm supposing that if it can be made according to these rules, then it's there. So yes, I am supposing that people make it. But in terms of the ergodicity, I mean, there is path dependence here. So if you go in some specific direction, it doesn't mean that you can necessarily reach something that's, you don't see causal invariance in this particular case.
So let's just try to understand. I mean, I'm not completely buying these particular rules. Maybe they are useful.
What's controversial about these rules? Rule number one is totally uncontroversial.
Okay, hold on. So you're saying 1 unit of capital builds 1 unit of product.
Okay, so one thing about this is I'm not really treating these as units. I'm trying to get some abstract rule for how the economy works. Very abstract. Okay, so here's the thing. You get capital, you expend capital, build product. Totally uncontroversial. Okay, but then we have to be able to separate consumers or even just the act of buying something from what an enterprise does, or what a business or a firm does, right? Because with a business or a firm, yeah, you're buying products, you have inputs just like everyone else does. But if your capital is sufficient, and that means the quality of your labor is sufficient, the quality of your physical capital, the machinery that you have is sufficient, you're able to take those inputs and create some output and replenish your capital, right? I mean, that's what we do at the company. We buy stuff at the company, but we also have talent, we have good technology, and we're able to produce an output and replenish our capital. So that's what the second rule is. I think that's like a basic rule of economics, right? If you don't have sufficient capital, then you're just a buyer and you're not going to be able to survive. You're not going to be able to be buoyant as a business. That seems like a basic rule of business. Now, there's something that could be.
I'm just coming back to something I'm thinking about a little bit more, which is this, the fundamental point of sort of, which maybe is at a different level from what you're talking about. The fundamental point of the sort of reducibility, finding slices of reducibility from irreducibility, because the very formation of something like a firm, e.g., firms, e.g., all of the aggregations, markets, etc. These are all aggregations that attempt to coarse grain the underlying irreducibility. I'm sorry, I'm just looping on that point because I think that's a relevant way to perhaps understand what, and it's.
Yeah, so I mean, markets should be something that form from this model. I'm not even really specifying that there are entities, right? I'm just saying that there has to be some difference between just buying things and then, actually, here's the thing, because if you look at the examples where you're basically just buying stuff, which is like, you take the leftmost path here, that ends quickly. Why does it end quickly? Well, it's because it doesn't really survive under iterations. It's like I have some capital. Let's say I have a bunch of oil wealth, okay? And I buy something, I've used up some of my wealth, I buy something else, and then I didn't develop any business, boom, that's it. You're basically done there. So that's an option in terms of the economy, right? But that's not going to sustain you over time. So it's like, okay, I have, you have some capital, you have to practice capital formation in some way so that you're making things, and then there will be transactions if you include the events in this graph. And then you're selling things, you're getting more money back, you're replenishing your capital, and then you're able to actually grow from there.
I just don't understand here. Okay, I don't understand. In the end, ignore this rule for a minute. Okay.
Which one? The second one?
The third one.
Yeah.
Okay. Ignore that one for a second.
Fine.
Basically, what's going to happen here is, you're just going to end up with a lot of product, a lot of dead inventory here, because there's no way to, in this model, there's no way to take product and turn it into money.
This is just going to grow, right? Just the X expressions are just going to grow.
Yeah.
Definitely. Am I right? Am I wrong?
No, you're right. You're right. I'm not understanding how, and I think this rule of taking product and turning it into innovation, I don't believe in that rule as such. I mean, just as a practical innovator, that doesn't what I see happen, so to speak.
Well, but before you can have any innovation, you have to have some basic stuff to work with. This is the whole point of the iPhone. The iPhone, right, is a synthesis of all kinds of products. The wire is a product. The glass is a product. You have to have a certain number of products before you can make some sort of an innovation. Now, look, the one thing that I don't like about these rules is I struggle to come up with how many Kais, Pies, and News there should be. But this is my rationale. One is, buying something, that's really easy. Basically, anyone can do that so long as they have capital. Now, having some sort of a business where you're using capital and it's being replenished, you're building products, that's slightly harder. So I'll use two Kais instead of one. It could be 3, it could be 4, but that's just I think it's gonna, you
It's not
know,
going to make much difference.
it's not going to make, and it's going to have just kind of a retardant effect on the way that the graph grows. And then finally, I think that innovation is even more rare than having a business, because there are all kinds of businesses that don't really innovate. So I chose 3 pies. It could be 11 pies if you want to make
All right,
innovation
okay.
really rare, but that's the general idea.
Okay, but I still want to understand what the kind of what the ontological status of this graph is somehow.
Okay,
I mean,
fine.
in other words, all right, so you've got these things that can be done by agents, let's call them.
Okay.
It could, you know, this agent here could decide to use their chi's and buy product. They could also decide to use their chi's and to build product.
Yes.
And each one of these arrows corresponds to a different choice that they can make.
Yes. Yes. That's the
Okay.
idea.
So now the question is, what do we imagine this graph is actually of? Is it a graph of all possible economic processes, or is it a graph of what, you know, in other words, in actuality, every one of these paths will be taken by, oh, there's 5 firms that did that. You know, in this state of the economy, there's a bunch of firms that took on debt and did this particular thing. Whereas some other fraction of firms will do another thing here.
Right,
and
right.
something, you know, one of those paths may be so stupid that nobody will do it. Although it being stupid isn't necessarily a guarantee of that, but be that as it may, you know, so there'll be some weighting of these paths,
Yes.
which is externally applied.
Why is it,
and-
why isn't it intrinsic?
Well, because that
To the
depends
behavior.
on a lot of details that you're not modeling here.
No. Oh, well, maybe when I say the weight, oh, you say the weight of the path,
Yes.
the actual path. Okay, yeah, that's extrinsic, right? But there'll be weights for the states according to how many paths lead to them. That's
But they
intrinsic,
will, right?
But that's
But I mean-
different. Yeah, fine. Okay.
Right. But I mean, so you might make an assumption, which is like an ergodic assumption for statistical mechanics,
Mhm.
that says what matters is the counting of states, basically, that every state will be visited. So you might as well just count states to find out what will happen.
Fair enough.
Now,
Okay.
I don't know if that's correct for economics or even close to correct. I mean, in other words, there's a, you know, is it the case that for everybody, I mean, in some sense, in many markets, there's sort of an assumption of that happening because, you know, a market wouldn't work unless there were a roughly equal number of people who wanted to buy and sell Bitcoin.
Well, right. Yeah, that's part of the idea. I mean, nothing here seems terribly absurd. Like the idea that people have capital and they mostly just spend it. I mean, that's not, if you want to be an entrepreneur, that's not good because it's that you just call that burn, right? But if you're not a business, it's just called spending, and people do that kind of thing all the time. People spend all their money all the time. It's not a good practice.
I mean,
people do it.
so look, the question is, you know, one of the questions, like in studying biology, there's the same kind of question. If it can happen, will it ever happen? You know, if you can make a stegosaurus with weird plates on its back, will you in fact make it? Or is it the case that there is some invisible or visible hand that's causing the thing to go on a particular path rather than another one?
Right.
And, you know, my guess is in biology, one is much closer to everything will get made than one might think. And so in economics, I mean, that's a question. Is it?
Think so for biology? I mean, there's probably all kinds of weird alien life that, because of path dependency, we don't have on this planet. And then you might say, oh, well, it could happen elsewhere, but then you'd have to have kind of similar conditions on that planet in order for that.
I was thinking at a different kind of morphological level. But let's not get drawn into biology here. That's a different discussion. Okay, let's go on and look at some more of what you have here, because rather than arguing about this particular model.
Okay, let me just summarize. So so one thing here is that, as you said, at each time step, you have different decisions regarding what you can make, right?
Mhm.
So then those decisions that have the same ancestor, they're going to be directly connected in branchial space. So that's why I think that branchial space, especially branchial distance, is a good way for meta modeling competition. If you have states that in the physics project we would describe as being entangled, then it means that they're kind of competing for some agent's decision at a given time step. right? So if you have
Well,
a
you're making a claim that things which are, I mean, this is similar to a claim I've been making in biology, that sort of speciation is, you can speciate by being a distance apart in branchial space or in physical space for that matter. But in quite literally, in biology, when did we have a common ancestor
Yes.
with a frog or something like that?
Yes, yes, right.
There's a branchial distance between us and frogs that is determined, well, depends on how you define branchial distance, but it's certainly related to common ancestry distance.
Yeah.
So in the
right.
case of economic decisions, for example, you're making the claim that somehow that the competition, I'm not sure how convinced I am of this. I mean, that competition.
Well, let's just take the rule chi goes to pi, right? Let's say it's chi goes to pi, and you have 2 chi, and there are 2 different pies in this graph that you could buy, for instance, right? Well, why can't those be 2 different products where there's a competition between those 2, where the given agent's going to buy one of these or the other?
Wait a minute. I mean, I'm still trying to understand kind of what this graph means. I mean, I think we should go on and look at I'm not getting fully this competition idea. I mean, I think that
Wait. You understand the idea. I mean, just the first time step in this graph, right? Just take the 2 leftmost, the left one and the middle one, right? Where you have some capital and then you're acquiring some product. Well, there are 2 choices there. And I'm presuming that these are going to be different products, right? Because this is totally abstract. They just say pi, but this should be a whole economy, right? So I'm going to buy one or I'm going to buy the other. So why aren't those 2 in direct competition for each other?
Well, you're saying whenever a consumer could at that moment pick doing this versus doing that, you can think of those things as being, at least for that consumer at that moment, sort of competitive choices, so to speak.
Yeah. And the point is that if you just have this capital and you're trying to spend it, you're like a particular kind of consumer. Whereas if we're deep into the graph, right, and there are products and there are all kinds of other things that have been built, then you're going to be purchasing something else, right? You're kind of deeper into some value added process, and you're not buying something simple. You're probably buying something more complicated that's relevant to what you're doing at that stage in the value added, phase of the value chain, something like that.
Let's keep going because we're going to run out of time here. I just want to cover some of the other things that. Where should we look to try and see some sort of punchlines of various kinds?
Well, if you scroll up, I wanted to say something about that original branchial graph.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe it's controversial whether or not branchial space models competition. I happen to say, I mean, part of the difficulty here is I think that this first graph isn't fully understood, and it could probably be improved. But I still imagine that at some point we have a good graph that models economic choices. We can agree that if the graph actually does model choices that agents are making, that the branchial graph is going to show competitive relationships between those choices, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Fair enough. Okay. So let's zoom down, or let's scroll down. So the idea here is, as soon as we have these competitive relations, we can start to model, some sort of a market. And in the beginning, we're going to see, basically there's going to be connections between all of these. And I would say that the more connected the branchial graph is, the closer you are to, a highly competitive market. It means everyone's competing basically with everyone else. Now, that's not the way that overall markets work. They have particular sectors of competition. So then as the branchial graph evolves, you have different subgraphs of these that are connected, but the overall thing isn't totally connected, because that's not how an economy works. Not all firms are competing with each other. Now, the key point that I wanted to show here, which I thought was exciting, is that not only do you have competition, but you have this overall behavior in that above graph, that's going to give pathways to these different states, which is basically, and I agree, it's basically under an ergodic hypothesis, which is if everything that can happen in that economy is going to happen, then if that is the case, then what inferences can we make about the profitability of, you know, a given product or a given particular innovation? And my conceit was that it's going to be, you know, I guess under ergodicity, the more paths there are that lead a consumer towards a given destination, the more traffic you're going to have, the more demand that you're going to have. Now, what's interesting in this particular case is that the profits appear to be captured. But well, one thing is that you have this like almost Ricci flow like behavior in these graphs where you have these kind of distinguished, at least in this main component, you have these distinguished kind of subcomponents that are forming, and you have just a few branchial edges between them. And that you see that most of the profits are being captured by these kind of intermediaries that are helping to connect this market, which basically seems about right in the real market. As soon as you're relying on someone, be it a distributor or a search engine or someone providing financial services to help you get from one side of the market to the other, those are the ones that are going to capture the profits. So
Sure.
I thought that was kind of an interesting finding.
Yeah, I mean that's the, you know, in the non-optimization of profit of our company, for example, we are not a middle person, so to speak. We are attempting to provide, right? I mean, it you know, being an intermediary is well, you know, is potentially a good way to make profits unless you get squeezed out in some way. But what you're showing is that there's a kind of a in this particular model, there's kind of only one way to get through that area, and it's through that one entity, and so that entity is going to pick up all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, and it gets more accentuated if you go down. I mean, I think some of the last examples are it gets pretty dramatic. Yeah, right. I mean, so look, what's the overall lesson here? The lesson here is if we're going to meta model economics, we have to have some rules. And those rules, we can experiment with those rules. Maybe you think that the rules should be slightly different. We can try with all kinds of different rules. They have to make some rational sense. And then we look at the behavior. Now, in order to do this, we have to have some kind of framework. We have to have some understanding of the economy, and we have to have some, I mean, I basically view them as meta modeling ontologies, where it's like when I'm looking at this graph, I'm looking at it in terms of competitiveness and profitability, but we could look for all kinds of other things. Now, I think one kind of key question is how coarse-grained, how rarefied we want these graphs to be. I think that there are certainly agent models that could be far more disaggregated or non-deduplicated than these graphs. And I think also we have to really understand the first graph that I had. I think to be a little self-critical, I think that it's supposed to show different kinds of behaviors that contribute to value-added activity according to basic rules where you can, you can buy products, or basically acquire products. You can also, use capital to build products in a self-sustaining way, and you can innovate. Those rules could be slightly different. It's kind of a weird way of looking at, it's not how you would normally model a supply chain. Trying to model the overall growth or progression of the economy as, interwoven kind of value activity chains, which I'm basically calling supply chains. But it's not, I don't think it's fully matured as a thought, but it's, we're going to have to get better at this.
Okay.
It doesn't seem that easy really to come up with rules without just having a bunch of them, like having like
I know. And then it becomes, that's why I think what's really critical is, it could be that everything, that key features of an economy are driven by one effect, just like, the structure of a snowflake is driven by growth inhibition. Once something has aggregated in one part of the growing snowflake, it is more likely not to aggregate in that same place at the next step. Yeah. And the issue, I'm still looping on this whole question about the computational irreducibility, the knitting together of parts of the economy. My intuition is that the fact that it is possible to extract things like single prices and so on, and other aggregate features of the economy, as opposed to making sort of aggregated products. The fact that it is possible to look at the economy and say, oh, I can think about that just in terms of there being a price for something. The fact that those kinds of things are possible, I suspect, happens for the same reason that continuum space emerges. That even though there are lots of microtransactions underneath, that you can summarize the effect of those microtransactions, that it's enough to summarize the effect of those microtransactions in terms of this one continuum result.
Well, right. I mean, in this case, what I presume is, let's say you take some particular pocket of the branchial graph. If that thing's fully connected, then in that particular sector, there's full competition. And if the path weights are more or less the same, then no one's really making more profit than the other, right? So I imagine in that case, you're going to have competitive pressure. You're going to have price pressure towards convergence, I imagine, because everyone's in kind of full competition with each other, and no one's really getting more demand than the other person is. So those prices should probably be more or less the same. And that's basically uniformity in branchial space, right?
Yeah, okay, but look, I've got a different point here. So one of the issues is, same with biology, this kind of continuous innovation. You know, you always want to be better than the next organism type thing, which is somehow maybe in this case, it's a continual seeking of more and more reducibility in what is otherwise a computationally irreducible process. I'm not sure. I mean, I think.
Yeah, that's one problem. I mean, one problem in this model is that this whole business of extracting reducibility, that as an advantage, which it is in the market, that advantage is nowhere to be found. Like we should have some model eventually where, you know, the company or what have you that's able to extract great reducibility from rich underlying irreducible work, that should be some great advantage in the economy. There's nothing like that right now. That's really important though.
Yeah, but look, I keep on coming back to this idea that, you know, at the lowest level, there's just a bunch of transactions. And that then.
But hold on. The thing is, that can't be the lowest level. There's no way that can be the lowest level, right? Because in order to have transactions, you have to be exchanging stuff, right? You have to have something like capital. It can't just be transactions at the bottom. There's no way.
Why is capital any different from stuff? I mean, the fact that it's $1 as opposed to just an NFT for whatever, as opposed to some barter token somewhere. Why does it matter that it's capital? What's special about capital, other than the claim that capital can buy anything?
Yeah, it's liquid. Yeah, it's more liquid. I mean, but okay, let's just say stuff or capital, something. I mean, the whole point is you can't just, when we're doing transactions, we're not exchanging nothing for nothing. So there's something that precedes transactions, I claim.
Sure, but I mean, taking capital as an example, there's kind of generically, you know, it's $1, it works almost anywhere in the world. Or it's a, particular sort of local currency minted by the artisans of such and such a place.
Yes.
In which case it is sort of capital, but it's not capital that allows you to buy a Starbucks in, wherever. So, I mean, it's unclear to me that capital, beyond the statement that it's like a pluripotent stem cell or something, it's it can buy a range of things, whereas I don't know. I mean,
well, fine, but even if
it's just, I mean, there has been, there has been discussion within economics first about the nature of capital, because it can mean, the monetary value that you've invested in something, but it can also mean the physical thing that you're using for production. Mm-hmm. And then it's not clear to me if both definitions are applicable to the model. I mean, if you're using stuff to produce stuff, or if you're just thinking of this as, money that you can bring to the market and then buy whatever stuff you need to produce the next step of stuff that you're producing.
Right.
But then, there have been a lot of discussions about the fact that, physical capital cannot be used to produce anything. So you're actually stuck with whatever capital configuration you have at one step. And you can't really easily change to any different configuration at will. So you have to think about all the possible combinations of capital structures that will enable you to satisfy your production desires or your consumer, the desires of your consumers.
You know, one thing that's confusing to me, and it's maybe a terminology question in economics. I mean, one talks about, you know, capital expenditures, you know, buying stuff like buying office furniture or whatever, you know, buying computers or whatever it is. And then one talks about capital like money in a bank. Why are those two things? I mean, those two things are equated because they are things that you own that have some sort of supposedly
And value. They both have value.
Yeah, well, the
Right.
point is that they're united in the balance sheet. They're united in the accounting because you need to
Yes.
transform the stuff that you've put on the firm. I mean, accounting effectively means that you need to put a value on it so that you can assess whether your company is in a good financial position or not.
Yeah,
So
right.
the fact is that you use the same term for two different things. One is a financial term and the other one is a physical term, but you need to translate between the two if you want to manage your business.
Right. And in this particular model, money, physical capital, like tools, machinery, office lamps, tissue paper, whatever, and labor, that's all capital. I mean, that's what's hard with this though, which is okay. So Stephen, here's a question, which is on the one hand, you could try doing what I did, where you're trying to come up with simple rules, but those simple rules are very abstract, where you're not differentiating, between different kinds of capital. And I'm presuming that, pi is just a product that has greater value added in a supply chain than pi, something like that. Now you could do that where the rules themselves have some ontological significance, or you could just have rules where, like with the physics project, where you're just trying all these different possible rules. Now, the one problem there is we could try doing it that way, where we're not going to try to make the rules as ontological because it's very difficult because they become abstract. But then I'm not exactly sure how we'll come up with a greater ontology for these graphs, because right now I'm trying to interpret these graphs according to what the symbols mean, because the symbols have some ontology in the rule. So that's a kind of methodological question.
Yeah, I think the problem is it's incredibly easy to end up with an unbelievably complicated agent-based model in which you can interpret nothing. So,
Yes.
So the issue is, what are the core effects? And this is why I keep on drilling, and I think there's something there about this whole sort of generation of reducibility.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that in the end, insofar as the physics project is doable, it's doable not because one is down at the level of looking at individual hypergraph rewritings. One is using the individual hypergraph rewriting results to build an intuition that allows one to paint a broader story. And I think that's what has to happen here. Now, whether one will be able to get that intuition by looking at the particular kind of model you have or not, I don't know. I doubt it will be of great advantage to have an incredibly, accurate model that has, models for interest rates and this and that and the other. It's extremely unlikely that will be, that will be useful, because it's extremely hard. Okay. The problem of doing science from the natural world is a problem of trying to reduce the complexity of the natural world to something about which we can make a human narrative. You can be in exactly the same situation with your models, that your models are sufficiently complicated that you effectively have to do another level of science to be able to say something on the basis of those models.
Yeah.
Which is kind of not.
No, that's not the point. Definitely.
Right. I mean, but I think one of the things that's important here is, to me, there's some very basic questions which again don't. One of the questions is, why is it reasonable to talk about prices for things? Because I'm not sure that's obvious. Maybe that's obvious, but
so what you mean when you say talk about prices for things? So let's take, you mentioned the black economy, the black market before. But let's just talk about like the informal economy, right? So in many nations, the informal economy is just huge, right? It's like most people are in the informal economy. That's like you step outside of whatever building you were in, and they're just people selling, sneakers that imported from China and local foodstuffs and clothing, like all this
What are
stuff.
they selling them for? Are they selling them for money, for cash?
Yeah, they're selling them for
Cash.
but it's not taxed and no one has good data on it, So it's like in many countries.
No, but
there's
that's still
more-
not the thing that I'm talking about.
No,
I mean,
hold on.
Yeah, yeah.
The point is that in these economies, right, where there's not a lot of data about them and it's very informal and people are haggling and negotiating, right? What is the price of
I
one
see.
of these goods at a given point, right? It's very hard to tell, but the point is that there should be some way of, there is going to be some average price, and it's going to be because one person, the way that I've been trying to understand this, right, is that one vendor or hawkers, or sometimes called whatever, one vendor is competing with some other vendor that's nearby. They get some sense of what the other person's price is. So people are going to be in competition. There's going to be some general price pressure there. There's also going to be different levels of demand, and people are going to have different levels of success, which should also have some effect on the price, which is why I think that ultimately the framework that I have here is very crude and rudimentary, but I think that this idea of studying markets branchially, I think, is a good idea. And I think that the interconnectedness of branchial space should translate to more competitiveness. And the more competition there is, the greater the price pressure.
Okay, so let's take the example of hawkers arrayed down a road.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so now the question is, what does it look like in terms of price? I remember a model from long ago, a cellular automaton model of gas stations on freeways, which was, I'm not sure how good a model it was, but it was actually, it was more about the placement of gas stations, I think, in that case, rather than, but you can imagine the same thing. You've got your people hawking sneakers all the way down some, 30 miles of road. Okay, so the ones at one end, people mostly, let's say people are on foot, they're not driving down the road or whatever. And so they mostly are locally interacting with people. What would you expect to have happen? In other words,
but this seems contrived, because it's not like the people were born on the road, or they had to get there, and they're going to get all kinds of information about the market, before they end up at that particular point on the road, right?
Well, okay, so let's take it a slightly more aggregated. You've got a country, and you've got people selling, yams or whatever in different parts of the country.
Yeah, right.
And and then there's to me, it's kind of like, and I was wondering about this a while ago, kind of the analog of relativistic invariance of, one thing you can do is sell your yam locally. Another thing you can do is transport your yam to somewhere else and sell it there.
Yep.
And I'm trying to understand what the, whether there's a way to think about that. And, the intuition that I keep on coming back to is the fact that things have definite prices is a consequence, or the fact that there is any rigidity to this market is a consequence of the fact that there are lots of transactions. Put it a different way. If I, invent some random weird thing and I make only one of them, and I'm just going to sell that one thing. Yeah, or I'm going to barter that one thing with somebody. It's quite unclear what its price actually is. But go ahead.
That's what I'm not getting, because every time you have a transaction, you have a price. So you think
the transaction is for money, as opposed to barter.
Stephen, when you say price, do you basically mean like law of one price or price convergence or something like this across an economy?
Yeah, I mean that it is possible to, just like you can say a gas has a definite pressure, even though the molecules are bouncing around in lots of detailed ways, that, the claim would be that the fact that there is the simplification of just being able to say, and the price is X, is somehow a consequence of the connectedness of all these things. That if it wasn't, if people, if there were two completely disconnected economies.
But what is the difference between saying that, the gas has been sold for, $3 a gallon, I don't know how much it is in the US, versus the price of gas is $3 a gallon?
Well, so to give one example of this, I remember when I was in Accra in Ghana, you take these informal, I think they're like from Korea, these informal little trotro buses. They're like really small and they're everywhere. Okay, and it's all informal. You pay always with cash. I remember at some point the price went up because it's something that was happening in the oil market. But it kind of took me by surprise because it didn't seem like it happened, completely uniformly. Prices were kind of different, and it took a little while for all the prices to go up. So this is an example, right? Which is that eventually you'll have some price convergence, like for the price that it takes you to go from one part of the city to the other, or in terms of the food that you eat, et cetera. But different vendors are in slightly different situations. They're gonna respond to it slightly differently, and it doesn't take a long time, but it takes over the course of a few days, you can kind of see the overall price convergence happen. It's kind of perturbed, and there's some shifts, and it might not be completely uniform, but at some point that price convergence happens again. This is the general idea, right? But at some intermediate step, it could be that someone's selling something for more than some other person for all kinds of different reasons, but eventually everyone kind of figures out, okay, I need to raise the price. Not everyone might want to. It might hurt people's businesses or something, but they realize they'll need to.
I suppose what got me thinking about this a while ago was the whole cryptocurrency question of, even if you can't buy a coffee with your cryptocurrency, can it still have any sense of real value? And the intuition was, if it is connected to enough things that somehow, just like with computational irreducibility and gases and all this kind of thing, that it can, in some meaningful sense, have a real value just by virtue of its connectedness, without some absolute kind of connection to buying cups of coffee or something. I don't know. This is, I mean, these are maybe two multiple disparate things of whether, can you maintain, this kind of, the fact that prices do not jump around randomly all the time. I mean, they jump around a bit, but they have some degree of continuity to them.
Yeah.
Is presumably in part a consequence of the fact that they are thickly connected.
But it's also because I mean, if things were priced in Ethereum, then the prices would jump. They would be volatile. That's because the currency value itself is volatile. So I think one underlying thing
I don't think it's volatile. It's only volatile relative to dollars. If the economy was Ethereum based, you'd say the dollar is volatile.
That's right. Same holds for gold.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. But it's not.
What do you mean it's not? Well, it doesn't happen to be right now, yeah. But for better or worse. I mean, probably for the better. But I mean, my point is
that's a good point. Yeah.
My point is that I claim that the sort of the I don't know, the persistence of value is something to do with this connectedness business.
Yes. The level of transaction connectedness around a good that's being transacted in the markets will make this price more stable. I think that would be generally accepted by anybody. And conversely, if you don't have a lot of connectedness, by the fact that you cannot do arbitrage, by the fact that you don't have enough information about circumstances of prices, that makes it harder to put a price on things. So you're going to have more volatility. It would be the same thing as a listed company, the price of a listed company versus the price of a private company. It's very complicated to put a price on a private company if you're doing, a private equity transaction. And then you're going to look at things like, let me do some simulation of what the dividends are going to be of this company, or, which is what people actually do, and it's much more relevant, let me look at the comparables. Let me look at which prices have similar companies transacted for in the recent past. And that's that's a measure of price connectedness that's much weaker. So if you're just saying, all my fintech in Mexico went for, 200 times revenues last year, so I should put the same price on this fintech in Brazil or not. So that's a much weaker level of connectedness, and that will mean that it's going to be much harder to put a price on it.
But okay, so look, the first thing to understand, I mean, this whole network of transactions things is a non-branchial story in its first instance. It's like there was an actual was an actual network. Now, I think
I think that's the causal graph, the network of all the transactions. I think that's a causal story. So that's going to be more of a relativity story than a quantum story.
Possibly. But then what is the quantum story? The quantum story is different consumer choices or different choices
Yes.
being made.
Yes.
And then the question is, but there is only one, in the end, there is a particular price that gets published in the newspaper for something. Even though there are many different choices that different people could have made about whether to buy it or sell it or whatever. And I mean, is it the case? I mean, are you making a claim that in some sense that's kind of like a quantum measurement, so to speak, as in there are all these things that could happen and maybe different people do pursue those different possibilities? Well, I don't
It's
know.
probably, I mean, look, ultimately, whatever the Branchel graph is, it's going to include all kind of different market sectors, so to speak. So if you're talking about the price of something in particular, it's not a description of the overall Branchel graph. It's going to be a description of some neighborhood there. You could coarse grain over that neighborhood and get a general price, right? And especially if the price is more or less convergent, then you could do that. Now, if it's some sector, and maybe, Fred, you have an example of this. Actually, is there an example of some sector where you just never see price convergence, where there are like different competitors and they're priced way differently, and you don't see something like, you don't see price convergence
between the same good in different markets? I mean, yes, there was one actually. There is one that really puzzles me, like pulp. Pulp, the stuff that is used to make paper, is about twice as expensive in Europe than it is in China right now. And there is no logistic. I mean, I haven't fixed this puzzle, but there's no I mean, the companies that are selling pulp to Europe are the same companies that are selling pulp to China. And there hasn't been price convergence in years.
Well, maybe it's some price sensitivity. Maybe they calculate, just like if you've got multiple classes of customers, you say these customers can buy it at a higher price, so let's find a way to and geographical distribution is an easy such way to do it, to say if these customers, if the market will bear a higher price in this place. I mean, like for example, for us, we often discount things for developing countries because otherwise we wouldn't. One can think of that as a philanthropic act, or one could think of that as a pure, otherwise we wouldn't sell anything there type act. So perhaps that's what's going on there. I don't know. The market simply won't bear the price that they're charging in Europe, and they say, well, let's charge what we can charge in Europe. I mean, I'm afraid this is the same thing, isn't it? That what happens with for example drugs and so on, that they have very different prices in different countries for what the market will bear type reasons, rather than for some other I mean, maybe there are also other reasons there, like there are pickier regulators in some countries than others, so it costs more to operate there. I don't know.
How are we going to meta model regulation?
Usually you would find some explanation in terms of why the arbitrage is not possible, or not desired.
I see what you're saying. Right. I mean, that's in the software.
In the case I just can't understand why there isn't arbitrage, because there are no constraints for reducing the supply.
Maybe nobody thought of it. I mean, it's like, look, it used to be the case that there was all this gray marketing stuff in software back in the day, 30 years ago or something now, where because the prices were higher, but I mean, that was a case where as you're distributing software in other countries, you have a longer supply chain because you have a local, in order to satisfy local regulations, in order to do local sales and so on, you have to have a local local representative, and you have to give that entity some cut. And so inevitably what you don't want to have happen is that if you discount things relative to the price where you're selling directly, then you get these things that happen where people are buying that. There's an alternate pathway basically for buying stuff, and it's typically hard to shut that down. I mean that's but I mean, and which is basically saying there's arbitrage, and if arbitrage can happen, it will happen, so to speak, unless there's some some obstruction to arbitrage, which might be, regulations, or it might be some other thing, contracts of some kind.
Yes.
But you're saying, arbitrage sort of qualitatively feels like the presence of arbitrage qualitatively feels like, oh, there are more gas molecules in that place than in that place. Diffusion will even it out because that's sort of qualitatively, and it feels like what should happen with arbitrage is that in situations where things are sort of moving fast enough that there isn't time for diffusion to even things out, then there is then there can be a difference, so to speak, that a small number of of traders can take advantage of. But as soon as it's kind of part of the bulk, the thing will even itself out. At least that will be my qualitative understanding of that. I don't know. I think one of the questions here is, one of the key questions again is, what is the question? And in the case of, let's say, biology or something, there's a very clear question, which is like, why are there species? Why are there as many species as there are? What is the comparable question for economics?
Well, but that's one question that interests you in biology. There are all kinds of questions in biology that you could ask. The same for economics. We should just make a list of questions that we care about and meta model them.
Yeah. Well, but
there are questions that we won't ask. Right? It depends on what you care about in economics, right? There are probably economists who are mostly thinking about how you can, how the bourgeoisie, ruling class can be overcome by, a vanguard revolution. There are all kinds of questions you can ask in economics. It depends on what you really care about, especially in economics, which is a highly fractious, contested area of study.
Right. But one question is, in many of these fields, there's sort of foundational questions. Look, the thing that where did this all come from? We were trying to use physics project ideas to make something which is kind of like a cryptocurrency, but does not involve centralized ledgers. And that led to the question of, so what actually, what makes something have value in an economy? Mm-hmm. Because in a cryptocurrency where you can't buy cups of coffee, what causes that thing to have value? And sort of the kind of glib version of it is it has value if people think it has value. And slightly more sophisticatedly, it ends up having value if it has many connections to other things. But I guess in that case,
but it's not just the connection to other things, right? Actually making real value takes time, and it takes value-added activity. Take an example like rockets. Rockets have value, I suppose, because they're connected to things that people value, but also just producing value in the world is some irreducible time process.
I know, but in a sense, right. So we keep on coming through this idea that value is in part, it's like lemmas in metamathematics. It's kind of like, I can just buy a rocket. Oh, well, the alternative is I can buy all the raw material for the rocket and try and assemble it myself.
Yes.
And this concept that, value is somehow related to, what is the relationship between value and computational work? Is it the case that when you bottle up a car, so to speak, that has value because embedded in that car is all this irreducible computational work that you now don't have to do?
Yes, that's what I think. Yes, and I think my example might be a little too contrived because I just wanted to model value chains. I think your point is that you want to understand where value comes from in a less contrived example, because I'm just kind of presuming in my multi-way system that with time you just have value being created and the agents are making all these different choices, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a highly kind of artificial example. We want to see in general how this plays out. But yes, I think there's a great affinity between computational irreducibility and value in economics. Because look, in economics, manufacturing or producing any kind of good or service, it's just some process. It's some process that's ultimately discrete and it follows some underlying rule. And when you buy something, you don't have to do all that yourself. That's what makes it valuable.
Right. But I mean, so the question is, you don't have to. So there are these two competing things in my mind.
I mean, this
Go ahead.
kind of make 2 points. So, I mean, one would be two things that value is not, from the perspective of economics, is not raw computational work. As you know, if you think that people could be just digging holes somewhere that doesn't lead to anything, and under a value perspective, it would be hard to justify their wages. And also, even if you're thinking about computationally irreducible work, meaning efficient, you're going from path A to path B in a computationally efficient way, it also depends on the value that's put on B, because if it doesn't matter how efficient your production process is or how complex and efficient it is, if you're coming down to something that doesn't itself have a market value, then the economy is not going to give any value to the computationally irreducible work that you've done. But having said that, I mean, you will arrive at something that is, value equals computational work, and finding efficient computational shortcuts in the production process. If you compare two things, let's say you can build a watch. You have two identical watches, and you can build one with a much cheaper production process versus the other. Then the value, you're adding value in the sense that as a firm, you will be more valuable as a firm because your profits will be higher. So in a sense, it means that you're kind of being, if the creation of value is the extraction of wealth from the production exchange process.
Okay,
Well,
let me see if I understand. So first point is, you can do a lot of work. Sadly, I see this from time to time. You can do a lot of work and nobody cares about the output.
Right.
And so you're saying
you can do very sophisticated work. I mean, think about a work of art that no one values, and that's not going to have value from an economics perspective, because you're not going to be able to translate that in the market.
Okay, so what is it about? So is it necessary that, I mean, as an empirical matter, if it was really easy to do something, eventually people will do it very cheaply. And so if it is going to be, if you're going to keep the price up, it had better be the case that somehow it was actually intrinsically hard to do.
Right. I mean, this is, I struggled with this, right? Which was, on the one hand, there's all kinds of, you could go to excruciating effort to produce something that no one cares about. But on the other hand, if something is in the economy, I presume, and if we even presume that, the paths that are be taking are the most efficient ones, then if you're producing some novel value, you've gone some extra step, you found something new to do with existing capital, be it, existing technology or personnel or what have you. You've actually pushed forward and done something that people hadn't done before. And they couldn't have done it. They couldn't have done it without making that step, because people are, being efficient, and it's irreducible. The problem is, I think what's contrived about the model that I have is, it's like, this is the value chain, it is the value network, it is the economy. So if something is in the economy and it's actually working, then people do value it. There's all kinds of other processes, I suppose, that are computationally irreducible and have computational work that people don't value. And I really have no idea how to model both of them, because it's like, yes, there'll be ones that involve computational work that no one cares about. But then if we're actually in the economy and we've kind of exogenized those other ones, the ones that people do value will also be computationally irreducible.
Okay, so but this business about whether people value it is very closely related to observer theory and so on. I mean, that is, if it's just some random thing that's flapping around and it's, producing all this complicated computationally irreducible stuff, the observer just says that's flapping around, it's really complicated, as opposed to, right? So, I mean, I think that's where the statement that they went to a lot of work and nobody cares is, I think, in part, they went to a lot of work and the observer cannot reduce it.
Well, then forget about von Mises then, because right. I think that we're taking a different direction, which is we do actually care about subjective theory of value in terms of what, we actually
Because the
do.
observer is in there.
Yeah, we care about what it is that makes it so that people actually care about things. I mean, what I did was really trying to do it the von Mises way, but observer theory, this seems more refined. I get it. Okay, so we have these different processes, the ones from which you can extract reducibility according to some actual abstraction tower. These are ones that we kind of hypothesize that observers are going to value because there's some actual reducible thing that they can say about it. This is my phone, this is my desk, blah, 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 blah. I'm not talking about the wood in the desk, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I agree with this. It's consistent with observer theory. It's consistent with the physics project. This does seem better.
So then the concept is, in the end, the place where value is, you do a lot of irreducible work, and let's see, and there's essentially a valuation function that is what the observer puts on it, that says how much they care about it. But there are constraints, I suspect, on that valuation function that come from this whole network of irreducible things. And my guess is that it's at that interface that, just like in the derivation of, gas laws, general relativity, whatever else, it's at that interface that something interesting and universal happens. And we have run out of time.
Yeah. Well, this has been really interesting. I mean, I've certainly been thinking about this abstraction tower stuff because we've been discussing it for some time and I had absolutely no idea how to meta model it. But thinking through this kind of, not very good example that I have here, this has been really helpful.
Right. I think the thing that I'm still very confused about is the role of branch Hill space in all of this, because I do think, the thing that I had imagined like a year ago or something was that there are sort of all possible economic things that could happen branchially, and that the ones that are actually picked out are the ones that have, I imagined, that are ones that have some of observability that doesn't just look like something. It's not well set up. And I think, okay, more to figure out. I'm afraid one of the problems here is that we sort of talked about this. I talked about this maybe a year ago or something, or a little bit more. And I somehow we need to get to more concrete points so that otherwise what happens is, I've kind of forgotten a lot of what we figured out. I'm a little bit concerned that we actually had notes from previous iterations that we may not have been looking at, and we should make sure we find those.
Yeah.
But okay, we're somewhat launched. Fred, any last comments from you for today?
Yeah, I think first of all that the whole discussion touches a lot of things that we didn't go into, but are connected to both, so sort of like classical problems of economics, and also to discussions that existed in the recent past in economics, but people don't talk too much about because somehow the discipline has decided to go in a direction without actually solving the problem. One of them is, things that we talked about here, like the capital controversy, which is precisely about whether you can talk about capital as a homogeneous thing or you need to take it apart and think about the interactions of the different parts. And what I would say is that this makes a lot of sense, and probably the next thing to do would be to think about the various ways to structure the model, the ontology of the entities for the model, and think about which ones are the ones that, using the machinery of the physics project will yield results that can be translated into interesting things, into the things that we want to answer. But I think this makes a lot. It's more an issue of systematically map the space of primitives that could go into these models and pick up models that are simple enough to build and interesting enough to yield results.
Right. All right. Well, we will let's continue at another time. And thanks to everybody here. Thanks to folks on our live stream who I haven't been paying attention to here because I've been too focused on what we've been saying. Okay, for a different time, we'll address some of those things. So, okay, well, bye for